Episode 12. Reed in the surface installation looked like every other maintenance depot on the Nelly's range. That was the point. Functional and unremarkable from the road, from satellite, from any angle that wasn't already inside the wire. Chain link topped with razor wire running the full perimeter. 2 guard stations positioned so their coverage overlapped without a gap. A vehicle bay where actual maintenance happened on actual aircraft because the aircraft were necessary and the maintenance on them was real, and the realness of it had to hold up under inspection. A water tower on the north end. A low administrative building with windows that admitted light the way any administrative building's windows did. An equipment storage block with no windows at all. Renn drove through the first gate at 6:14 a.m. The guard checked a tablet, looked at her face, looked at the tablet again, and waved her through with the economy of motion that comes from performing a task so many times the task has been compressed to its minimum. The lot she was directed to held 4 other vehicles. No visitor markings, no designation of any kind. She parked and killed the engine and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. The air outside was cold and would be cold for another hour before the desert changed it. The mountain range to the west showed the specific brown and gray of rock that doesn't hold moisture. A transport aircraft was running up its engine somewhere on the far side of the installation, the sound arriving flat across the open ground, and then it cut, and the installation was quiet. She got out of the car and walked to the administrative building. The man who met her at the door took her credentials without introducing himself. He was 40, maybe 45, dressed in the way of someone whose clothes had been chosen entirely for function over a long period of time, and who had stopped making distinctions between one day's choices and the next. The credential check was careful and unhurried, the attention of someone doing a job rather than performing one. He handed them back and held the door. Inside was a standard corridor. Linoleum floor, overhead fluorescents running at the color temperature of every government installation she'd ever worked in. A row of closed doors on one side, and a row of windows on the other looking out onto the lot she'd come from. The man walked her the full length of it without speaking. At the far end, a door opened onto a second corridor, and the second corridor had no windows, and its proportions were wrong for what the administrative building should have contained based on its exterior dimensions. She noted this without comment. The second corridor ended at a steel door with no handle on the approach side. The man pressed a card to a reader set nearly flush in the wall beside it, the seam visible only at a specific angle in the overhead light, and the door opened inward onto a room that held an elevator and 2 men who were there for reasons that didn't require explanation. They didn't look at her. They didn't speak. One of them repeated the card gesture at the elevator's wall reader. The doors opened. She stepped in alone. The doors closed. The car was large, built for equipment or for groups. The walls brushed steel with the quality of a surface that has been cleaned regularly for a long time. A single button on the panel. She didn't press it. The descent had already begun. 11 minutes. She'd been told 11 minutes. She knew the geology of this region well enough to understand what 11 minutes of controlled descent meant in terms of depth, and she understood what that depth meant in terms of what you build when you want it below the water table, below the fault lines, below the rock that any surface-level event reaches. Not an abstraction. A real number, a real depth, a real facility at the bottom of it that had been running continuously since before she was born. A narrow window ran floor to ceiling in the car's side wall, 4 inches wide, installed at some point in the car's history as a concession to the human tendency to need to see what surrounds it. She watched the rock face through it. The strata changed as she went down. Near the surface, the rock was recent in geological terms, compressed and layered but relatively consistent, the product of the last several million years of sedimentation and pressure, and the slow accumulation of material that doesn't register as movement because it operates on a timescale nothing alive experiences directly. She could read the sequence of it the way she could read a page. The lighter bands above the darker bands. The record running in one direction, older as you went deeper, everything above everything else for a reason. Deeper, the layers became more distinct, more compressed, the older material showing the quality of rock that has been bearing weight for long enough that the weight is no longer pressure, but simply what the rock is. Mineral intrusions cut diagonally across the horizontal record at intervals, events that had happened once and been preserved ever since. The geology logging things without anyone asking it to. She thought about what it meant that this was the record above a facility, and that the facility had contributed nothing to the record. 76 years of human activity in a sealed space, and the rock above it showed nothing. The rock's cut face had developed its own surface quality over decades. Not rough, not natural, not constructed in any conventional sense. The specific condition of a surface that was cut once and then sealed, and then subjected to decades of managed air in a confined space. Mineral seep at the microscopic level. The slow chemistry of a sealed environment working on a cut stone face, until the face was something that had no equivalent outside a space like this one. The lighting outside the window changed at some depth from incandescent warm to a consistent cool white. Installed fixtures set directly into the rock face at intervals, and in that light the strata became more precise. A dark band approximately 8 inches thick ran horizontal across the face at roughly the 2/3 mark. A mineral intrusion or a compression event from far enough back that nothing alive at the time had lungs to breathe with. She looked at it for the few seconds it took to pass, and then it was above her. She thought about 1948, about the engineering required to build something here in 1948, without the benefit of the technology the construction would eventually house. Without the propulsion principles they'd spent 30 years trying to understand. Without the materials science, they'd spent another 30 years learning from what they'd recovered. They'd done it with what 1948 had, and what they'd built had been running without interruption since then, and the rock above it hadn't moved and wouldn't move and would still be here, unchanged, after whatever happened next. She thought about the personnel who worked here, about what it meant to work in a facility that didn't appear in any directory. That predated the system that would have required it to appear, that had been running long enough that the people who built it were dead, and the people who worked in it now had no institutional memory of a time before it. The facility was the institution. Everything above it was the cover for it. She thought about why she was here, what the ICD needed from her that required this room rather than any room above it. The word echo had been in the briefing last week. She was 11 minutes below the surface of Nevada because of that word, which meant the word connected to something that required a depth that no other word she'd encountered in 15 years had required. The car slowed. The deceleration was smooth, engineered to a precision that spoke of maintenance that didn't get deferred because the consequence of not deferring it was something trapped at the bottom of an 11-minute shaft in a facility that doesn't exist. It stopped. The doors opened. The corridor was immediately and entirely different from anything above it. Original 1948 construction. She knew this without being told, the way you know the age of certain things by how they've worn, not damaged, not deteriorating in any functional sense, simply used for a very long time in conditions that don't vary. The composite panels covering the sealed rock showed their age at the seams, faint oxidation at the metal edges, the slow accumulation of 76 years in air that never changed. The overhead lighting was a consistent cool white, older technology running at a color temperature that spoke of a different era of institutional decisions, the era when this corridor was built, and when the people who built it thought they were building something temporary that would be superseded in a decade or two. They'd been wrong about the timeline. The floor was clean, immaculate, a stark contrast to the aged panels. Whatever cleaning protocols level 0 ran applied to the floor without exception. Her shoes on the floor were the only sound. No equipment hum, no air circulation noise, no voices from behind the closed doors on either side. The silence was not the silence of a space that was empty, but the silence of a space that had been this way for a very long time and would be this way after she left. The air was the thing she kept returning to as she walked. 15 years of classified facilities. Sublevels where the air carried the metallic quality of constant recycling. Operations centers where the air was warm from equipment density and tasted faintly of the plastics used in the equipment's construction. Cold server rooms with their specific mineral edge. She knew the range of what managed air could be. This air had no quality at all, not metallic, not stale, not the mineral smell of deep rock. Nothing. Breathable, completely breathable, the oxygen content whatever it needed to be, but stripped of every characteristic that air accumulates from contact with the environment that produces it. 76 years of processing in a sealed space, the same air recycled and recycled, until everything that gave air its character had been refined out of it. She breathed it, and felt none of the low-register physical responses that confined spaces usually produced, not the slight constriction in the chest that came with recycled air in deep facilities, not the specific dryness of air that had been moving through ducts and filters for years. Nothing. She breathed it, and it gave her body what it needed and nothing else, and the nothing else was its own specific condition, not a neutral state, but the result of an environment that had been running long enough to accomplish this, to take the air down to its function and strip away everything else it had ever been. She had been in the elevator for 11 minutes, and she had been in this corridor for less than 2, and she was already certain that the air would be the thing she remembered longest about level 0. The open door at the corridor's end led into the room, small by the standard of what she'd prepared herself for. Smaller than briefing rooms, smaller than operations centers, close to the dimensions of an interrogation room, except without the confrontational layout an interrogation room is designed to produce. A table, rectangular composite surface, newer than the panels on the walls, replaced at some point in the last 2 decades by someone who decided the original surface had served its purpose long enough. 2 chairs, one on each side. A screen on the wall to her left, dark and showing no indicator light. Overhead, a light running noticeably warmer than the corridor outside it, warmer than anything else since she'd gotten into the elevator. Someone at some point had made the adjustment to this specific fixture, and the effect was that the room was, in a limited and specific sense, bearable where the corridor wasn't. The walls were the original 1948 composite panels. The same oxidation at the seams as the corridor, the same faded institutional gray, possibly 50 years without repainting, possibly more. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room and at the man sitting at the far side of the table. He was old the way certain materials become what they are through long exposure. The process finished, the result settled. His skin had the quality of skin that had had no reason to activate melanin in years, not months, not a winter, but years, pale with the specific quality of someone whose biology had simply stopped expecting light and had adjusted accordingly. Not ill, not deteriorating, adjusted. His hands on the table were flat and steady, the hands of someone in their mid-70s who had spent those decades doing work that didn't require physical labor and whose hands showed it without damage. Just age and the specific steadiness of a person who has been still for long periods of time over a long time. His eyes were clear. He was watching her cross the room, and he did it with the patience of someone who had done this before and who understood that the watching was part of the process. No badge, no identification of any kind, no lanyard, no card at his collar, nothing clipped to his shirt. He predated the ICD's identification protocols. He'd been at level 0 since before the standardization that would have required him to carry credentials, and no one had ever added him to the system because adding him to the system would require acknowledging to the system that he was there. She sat down. She placed both hands flat on the table. He said, "You know what this facility is." "What I was told," she said. "Level 0, original construction 1948, pre-directory, not in any ICD record I've accessed in 15 years of access." "That's accurate," he said. "And you know why you're here." The briefing from last week contained the word echo. The word echo was the last thing the briefing was authorized to give you before this room, he said. Everything subsequent to that word requires this room. He looked at her steadily, the look of someone deciding whether to add a qualifier. He didn't add one. "I'm going to tell you a sequence of things. The sequence matters. Each thing changes the frame for the next, and if you hear them out of order, some of them land wrong. I'd prefer you hold your questions until I'm through. I'll stop if something becomes essential to address before I continue, but I'd like to get through the whole of it before we go back." "Understood." He looked at his hands for a moment, not gathering himself, just the pause of someone moving from one mode into another. She'd seen it before in people who did certain kinds of work, the shift from operational to informational, the different posture it required. "Before I start," he said, "you have 15 years of access at a level that gave you a substantial picture of what the ICD does and why it does it. Most of what I'm going to tell you is outside that picture. Some of it will reframe things inside it. What I want from you is to let the reframe happen as I talk rather than stopping to process each piece, because the pieces are only coherent as a set. Individually, they produce the wrong frame. Together, they produce the right one." She said nothing. "You were selected for this room because of your record," he said. "Not your operational record, your observational record. What you noticed and what you did with what you noticed and what you chose not to report and why. 15 years of that record is what this room needed before it would put someone in that chair." She kept her face still. "The signal," he said. She kept her hands flat on the table. 1977, the ICD was running deep space monitoring arrays built from the crash site technology we'd recovered starting in 1947. The purpose was to understand the propulsion physics well enough to replicate it. We understood parts of it by then, the electromagnetic principles at the low end, the material science at the surface level, but the propulsion was still outside what our physics could describe, and the gap was the whole point because the gap was what the program had been built to close. The monitoring arrays were listening across a broad frequency range for anything that might help us understand what we were actually working from. He shifted in the chair, just settling. "We intercepted a signal originating from a source 45 light-years out. The interception wasn't targeted. The analyst who flagged it almost didn't flag it, almost logged it as instrument artifact and moved on, because it was low power and it didn't match any profile the program had told her to watch for. She flagged it because the structure wasn't random, and she knew the difference between those two things. That decision is part of why we're sitting in this room." The analysis team ran 11 years of decoding. The team changed over those years. People rotated out and were replaced. The methodology changed twice when better tools became available, and the running record of what had been established and what remained open was the one continuous thread across all of it. What they recovered, in the first 3 years, was mostly navigational. Star charts, distance markers, stellar configuration data. The kind of content that doesn't require shared language because it describes physical reality any observer can independently verify. Two parties who have never communicated can still agree on where the stars are. That was the bulk of the signal. 3 years of work to establish that the bulk of it was navigational, and then 8 more years on what the navigational content was framing. The difficulty with the non-navigational section wasn't decoding. The difficulty was recognizing that what they were looking at was a response to something specific rather than a generic content block. The team lead wrote in the program's final summary, 11 years after the interception, that the non-navigational section had probably been parsable in the first 2 years, and that the 7 years it took was a failure of the frame rather than a failure of the tools. That summary is still in the program's record. He paused. She waited. The section that took 7 of those 11 years to parse was the non-navigational one. The reason it took 7 years is that it wasn't navigational, wasn't describing physical reality. It was addressing someone, a response to something we transmitted. Yes, something we hadn't known we were transmitting. He looked at her directly. The monitoring arrays we'd built from the recovered technology were broadcasting a signature embedded in the technology itself. We thought it was equipment noise. Low-level, consistent, present across all the arrays simultaneously. The kind of output you attribute to imperfect replication when you're working from technology you don't fully understand. We'd logged it for 26 years, noted it in maintenance reports, tried twice to eliminate it and failed and concluded the failure was a function of our incomplete understanding of the underlying physics and moved on. It wasn't noise. It was a recognition pattern, something the original designers built into the technology as a deliberate function, a way for the technology to identify itself and to identify the location of whoever was operating it. We'd been broadcasting the recognition pattern for 26 years before we understood what it was. The signal we received in 1977 was a reply to that broadcast, directed at the location the recognition pattern identified, addressed to us specifically because the recognition pattern had told whoever sent it exactly where we were and that we were operating technology we hadn't built. What did the response say? Most of it was introduction. Here is where we are. Here is the distance between us. Here is what we know about the space between us. The navigational content was context for what came after, the frame before the message. The part that took 7 years was a date, not expressed as a calendar date, expressed as a stellar configuration, a specific observable arrangement of bodies at a specific point in time, the kind of expression that requires no shared language because any observer with sufficient instrumentation can independently calculate it. The ICD ran the calculation for 3 years before trusting the result. The date was 11 years from the time of reception, 1988, and nothing happened in 1988. Nothing we detected. The date passed. The monitoring program was expanded rather than curtailed because the question of what we'd missed was more compelling than the question of whether we'd been wrong. 3 official internal assessments. The calculation was incorrect. The signal had been misunderstood. Whatever was meant to happen in 1988 had happened, and we'd lacked the equipment to see it. All 3 were possible and none could be ruled out. The program continued. The technology kept producing results that justified the resources. And somewhere in the program's leadership, there was a person who believed the 3rd assessment and who spent the next 3 decades building the monitoring infrastructure around proving it. He looked at her. 36 years later, the date came again. Not a new external signal. Internal analytical convergence from 3 separate programs operating in compartments that had never communicated with each other. Meridian, which you know from the Sokolova compartment. A second program running parallel to Meridian that I'll describe in a moment. And a 3rd program running out of a facility on the moon which your clearance has not previously included. 3 programs, same date, independently. From 3 different data sets, using 3 different analytical approaches, arriving at the same 30-day window 6 months before the window arrived. The convergence was flagged up the chain, and this room received it, and this room is where the decision was made about how to handle the window when it came. Berlin, she said. Sokolova found one of the signals. Meridian is based in Berlin. Sokolova was tracking anomalous deep space frequency activity that Meridian had been monitoring for 8 years. What she found was one of 3 convergent data points. We didn't know how close she was until it was too late to redirect her, which is why the Berlin outcome happened the way it did. Renn thought about what she knew about the Berlin outcome, the compartment she'd been given, the way the information had been shaped when it reached her. She kept her face still. The 2nd program, she said, runs under a designation I won't give you in this room because the designation itself opens a compartment you're not being read into today. What it does is monitor the crash site technology deployed across ICD installations in the solar system for the same recognition pattern we found in the monitoring arrays in the 1970s. It's been running since 1989. In the 18 months before the window, it began detecting a change, not in the recognition pattern itself. The pattern had been stable and consistent since 1989. What changed was a secondary element of the signature, something beneath the recognition pattern, something the program had been logging as baseline noise for 30 years without ever characterizing it successfully. In the 18 months before the window, it began to shift, systematically, in a direction the analytical team described as responsive. Responsive to what? To us, to our expansion, to the installations on the moon and Mars and the belt and the outer positions, to the scale of what we'd built and the distance between the installations and how fast we were getting there from where we started. The secondary signature was shifting in response to our growth. He said it without inflection. The recognition pattern doesn't only identify location. It identifies scale. It tells whoever built it not just where you are, but how far you've come from where you started. The shift had a rate, he continued. Not constant, accelerating. The program plotted the rate of shift against the rate of ICD infrastructure expansion across the solar system, and the correlation was close enough that the analytical team's report used the word unprecedented, which is not a word that ICD analytical reports use. The shift in the secondary signature was tracking our expansion with a precision that implied the technology wasn't passively recording. It was responding, in real time, to the aggregate output of every installation we'd built from the crash site technology. She thought about the gradient file at FSA sublevel 2. Stable anomaly, continuous. The file she'd looked at and not reported. What stable anomaly? Continuous meant against what he was describing aligned without any gap between them. No coincidence, just two pieces that had been waiting for the same frame. The date event, she said. The flight. The window arrived and the event wasn't what any of the three programs had prepared for. We'd prepared for a signal. A directed transmission, possibly targeted at ICD infrastructure, possibly broadband. We had monitoring across every frequency we could cover. Every ICD installation in the solar system running heightened observation protocols for the full 30-day window. He paused. What happened was a direct contact event with a single individual on a commercial flight. No ICD affiliation. No prior relationship to any of the three programs. The ICD had been monitoring her for 14 months as a precautionary measure because she was proximate to one of the secondary signature monitoring stations, and because her physiological profile matched a parameter set the analytical team had flagged. We didn't know she'd be contacted. She was one of several hundred individuals in that category under passive observation. What happened on the flight? 11 seconds. Her physiological data, collected remotely, showed a pattern during those 11 seconds consistent with receiving information at a rate, and in a format the human nervous system can process but cannot store conventionally. Not a seizure, not a cardiac event, nothing the aircraft systems detected, nothing the other passengers noticed. She sat in her seat for 11 seconds and received something, and then it stopped. What did she receive? 3 weeks of analysis and multiple debriefings, and what we have is fragments, impressions. The full content, if there was a single coherent content, didn't survive the processing intact. What did survive is consistent across every debriefing session and consistent with the ICD's assessment of what the 11 seconds were. He paused. An introduction. The communication equivalent of announcing yourself to someone before you say what you came to say. Not a message. Not an information transfer. The 11 seconds were I am here, I am speaking to you, I am something your mind needs to be able to hold before I tell you what I need to tell you. The ICD's assessment is that the 11 seconds were designed specifically for a human nervous system, that the rate and format were calibrated to what a human can receive without damage, that someone had thought carefully about how to do this and had gotten it right. He looked at her. The word you're not asking is whether it hurt her. It didn't. What she reported across 3 weeks of debriefing is that the 11 seconds felt like receiving information she already knew, not new information, familiar information delivered to a part of her that was prepared for it without knowing it was prepared. She looked at the dark screen on the wall, then back at him. The echo, she said. Yes. He repositioned his hands on the table, a small adjustment, and then they were still. The echo are what we've been reverse engineering for 76 years without knowing what we were reverse engineering from. Their technology is what we recovered from the crash sites. Their engineering is what gave us the monitoring arrays, the propulsion basis, eventually the installations. The crash sites were not accidents. The first 3 were deliberate. They were leaving us what we'd need. The ICD spent 20 years trying to determine why the vehicles came down where they did and in the condition they were in. And the answer, which the back channel confirmed 11 years ago, is that they didn't crash. They put the vehicles down. The damage was consistent with impact, but the impact was controlled, and the technology recovered was the technology they intended us to recover. The program we built on their technology was the program they planned when they chose the crash sites. She kept her hands flat on the table. They're humanoid, proportions slightly off, the specific quality of slightly wrong that you register before you can identify what's registering. Eyes that don't catch light the way human eyes do, something in the reflectivity, something in the angle at which the light returns. They've been described by the 4 ICD personnel who have had direct contact as looking like a translation, like the concept of a human being rendered by something that understood the concept completely, but had arrived at it from a different direction than evolution did. They communicate through technology that translates intent rather than language. The translation is accurate. The meaning arrives clearly, but the language the translation produces is always slightly imprecise, always a little off from what a native speaker would choose, never quite quotable. Every statement they make arrives understood but never verbatim. In 11 years of back-channel, the ICD's linguists have tried to find a pattern in the imprecision, and what they've concluded is that the imprecision isn't a flaw in the translation technology. It's a flaw in any language available to the translator. Intent translates perfectly. Language approximates. How long have they been communicating with the ICD? Back-channel for 11 years, beginning the year after the 3 analytical teams first identified the convergent date. The Echo initiated contact. They knew about our monitoring infrastructure, and they used a channel we'd built from their technology to reach us through a contact structured so we'd understand it wasn't noise and wasn't artifact, and wasn't anything we'd produced ourselves. The back channel is where everything I'm telling you today comes from. 11 years of limited, carefully translated communication. Every claim verified against what we could independently observe. Every statement tested against our own data before we accepted it. What are they invested in? She said. Specifically, in us. He looked at her for a moment before answering, the look of someone deciding how to open a specific door. In the last 3,000 years, they've watched us approach the threshold we're approaching now twice before. Both times something happened before we crossed it. The first time they were watching from far enough away that they couldn't intervene. The second time they were closer, but the event happened faster than their response could reach us. Both times what happened wasn't random. Both times the cause was the same source. He paused. The third time, they've been here for 3,000 years, leaving us what we need, making sure we understand what we're approaching and what the approach has meant before. They believe this time is different. That difference is what they are invested in. They stopped a war, she said. He looked at her carefully. Where did that come from? A compartment 3 years ago, single reference, an event in 1993, a description of the outcome. I noted it and didn't ask about it because the compartment structure told me it was outside what I was cleared for. It was outside what you were cleared for, he said. It remains there. What I'll say is that it happened, and the ICD has a record of it, and the record is above this level. What they did, and how they did it is not what I'm covering today, because it's not the part that changes how you understand what I'm telling you. What matters is why they stopped it. Not for us. For the approach. Because every year before the threshold is a year that matters, and a war at the scale of what was building in 1993 would have set the timeline back by decades. A timeline they're managing, she said. Facilitating, he said. The distinction matters to them. They've told us that. In the back channel. The distinction between managing and facilitating is the one thing they've been most precise about in 11 years of translation. Every time the ICD's back-channel team has characterized something as management, the Echo's response has corrected it. They're not managing us toward an outcome. They're making the space available for us to reach the outcome on our own. Whether we do is the question the back-channel has been building toward for 11 years. She said, the back-channel team, 4 people with direct contact, who selected them. This room, he said. Over 11 years, different people at different stages. The criteria evolved as we understood more about what the back channel requires. The translation technology handles the language. What you can't manage with technology is the person receiving the translation. You need someone who can sit across from something that looks like a human being and isn't, and listen to what it's telling them about the nature of their species and their history, and continue to function. She held that. The stratum, he said. I need to tell you about the stratum before the rest of it. She waited. The stratum have been in this solar system longer than multicellular life has existed on Earth. That's the ICD's best assessment based on 11 years of echo communication and on observational data from the lunar and Mars installations that we didn't understand until we had the echo's context to read it against. No fixed form. Their true form is outside the range of what human sensory processing can handle in a direct encounter. Not dangerous, not painful, just not processable. One continuous purpose that the ICD has been trying to define for 11 years without getting there. They don't communicate with us. They don't need to. They have been in this system since before complex life, and they will be here after whatever we become. And in their frame of reference, the ICD is something that appeared yesterday and will be gone shortly. The back channel has asked the Echo twice to attempt direct communication with the Stratum on the ICD's behalf, and both times the Echo's response was that they don't mediate for the Stratum. The Stratum communicate when they communicate, and the ICD has not been communicated with. But they are watching us. They are, consistently. The lunar installation has been logging their presence for 12 years, which is as long as the installation has had the instrumentation to detect it. They watch the installations, and they watch the secondary signature shifting, and they don't react visibly to either. The Echo's description of the Stratum in the back channel is more careful than the rest of their communication, more qualified. The Echo themselves may not be certain what they know directly and what they've inferred, and what they were told by species that observed the Stratum before the Echo was watching. He shifted slightly. The Stratum recognize humanity, not our civilization, not our technology or our intelligence or any of the markers a civilization puts out that says someone's home. They recognize the secondary element in the broadcast signature. The same thing the second program has been watching shift. The same thing the Echo recognized 3,000 years ago. The Stratum have seen this before. They have been waiting to see it again. In 11 years of back-channel communication, the Echo have tried to understand what the Stratum's watching means, and the clearest thing they've gotten back is that the Stratum don't know if seeing it again is a relief or a catastrophe. That the Stratum have been in this system long enough to have preferences about how it goes, but not long enough to know which outcome they're hoping for. She said, "You said 3,000 years. For the Echo. The Echo have been watching us for 3,000 years. The Stratum have been here far longer than that. The Echo began watching because of what they knew, and what they knew was not discovered by them. It came from species that no longer exist in any form the Echo can contact. What those species told the Echo about the secondary signature and what it indicates and where it comes from is the foundation of everything the back channel has told us and the foundation of everything else I'm about to tell you." He stopped. "This is the last thing. The ICD has been processing it for 11 years and hasn't finished. I don't expect you to finish it in this room. Hear it as information. Let the rest of it sit until it's ready to sit." She kept her hands flat. The warm light above ran steady. The air tasted like nothing. "Humanity did not originate in this solar system," he said. Nothing in her face moved. Earth was chosen deliberately as a destination. The people who chose it were biologically continuous with every human being who has ever lived on this planet. Homo sapiens is not the product of this solar system's evolutionary record. Homo sapiens is the product of a deliberate reset performed by a species that had already become something else, and decided that becoming something else had been a mistake they couldn't continue to make. He let that land. He waited. She kept her hands flat on the table. The air tasted like nothing. The room was the room. They stripped everything, not as a metaphor, biologically. The neurological structures that carry complex learned behavior gone. The genetic expressions of accumulated cultural development suppressed to a pre-technological baseline. Memory gone. Language gone. Technology gone. Culture gone. Everything a civilization produces over hundreds of thousands of years of development, stripped from the biology before the biology was placed on this planet. What was left was the underlying architecture. The capacity for language without any language. The capacity for tool use without any tools. The capacity for culture without any culture. The foundation without anything built on it. They chose Earth because it was isolated, because the distance from the original galaxy was sufficient that whatever was there wouldn't reach here before we had time to become something again. Because the solar system had the conditions required to let the biology develop on its own without interference. They chose Earth and they put themselves in it at the absolute beginning, and they did not leave instructions. They left nothing. Nothing left to leave. What they preserved was the capacity, and the capacity alone. They introduced the biology at baseline, and they let time do what time does. 30,000 years of it. More in some calculations. The ICD's best estimate is that the introduction happened between 30 and 40,000 years ago, which means that every human being who has ever lived on this planet, every civilization, every language, every piece of technology, every cultural artifact from the first tool to what the ICD is building now, is the product of 30,000 years of a species rebuilding itself from its own foundation without knowing that's what it was doing. Why? She said. 2 reasons. The first is what they'd become. The second is what noticed them becoming it. He held her eyes and his voice didn't change. The last time humanity reached the developmental stage it's currently approaching, in a different solar system, on a timeline the ICD can't fully reconstruct from 11 years of back channel, something in the original galaxy forced the reset. Not us. Something external. Something that existed in that galaxy long before us and that found us when we became what we'd become, to be a problem it couldn't contain any other way. It forced the reset. It forced the end of the prior peak. The reset was our choice, made in response to what we understood was coming and what we understood would happen if we didn't choose it ourselves. We chose to strip everything and start over in a different solar system rather than continue on the trajectory we were on, because continuing had one outcome. We understood the outcome. So we stripped everything and we chose this planet and we put ourselves back at 0 and we've been climbing for 30,000 years. She didn't move. He continued. The prior peak civilization, for all that we can reconstruct from 11 years of back channel, was what we're building toward now. Not identical, not a perfect preview, but the same species at the same general level of capability, with the same secondary signature at roughly the same intensity in the broadcast. The Echo's account of it is fragmentary because what they know came through intermediary species and translation chains long enough that the specifics are gone. What remains is the structure. A species that had achieved everything the secondary signature indicates and that encountered the threshold, and that made the choice the ICD now knows they made. The Stratum watched that choice, Renn said. The Stratum watched all of it, from beginning to end. They watched us become what we became in that galaxy, and they watched the thing that forced the reset, and they watched us make the choice, and they watched the biology arrive on this planet, and they've been watching the 30,000 years since. Whether they understand why the prior peak chose the reset or whether they think the choice was correct is not something the Echo have been able to determine. The Stratum don't explain themselves. They just watch. She looked at the table's surface. She looked at her hands. She thought about Abara's list. 47 names, and she'd recognized everyone. People who'd been inside compartments they hadn't been meant to be inside. People who'd talked or who'd been close to talking or who'd found things and started asking the wrong questions. The list had looked, when Abara showed it to her, like a maintenance problem. Like the ICD's ongoing work to keep the compartments clean. It looked different now. It looked like preparation. Like the program getting its record straight before something arrived that would examine the record. She thought about the Watcher in Chicago, the tradecraft slightly wrong for any human service she trained against. Not worse, not less competent, just different in ways she hadn't been able to place. The frame she now had for it was so clean it was almost audible. The stillness she'd noted and couldn't name, not a human operative holding still, but something for which stillness was simply the default state, had a name now. They'd been watching her for the same reason they'd been watching everything. Because she was approaching something, and they'd been waiting 3,000 years to see whether this time was different. She thought about the data fragment from AB7 and the single line of text she'd memorized, and that line resolved now into something she could read most of the way through without being told what the words meant. She thought about Cross in 1987, the simultaneous biological termination with no identifiable cause on the day of a crash recovery that wasn't a crash at all. That was a delivery. That was someone putting down exactly what we'd need. Whatever had terminated Cross and the others at that site had been protecting the delivery, not opposing it. The ICD had spent 37 years framing it as an anomaly, and it wasn't an anomaly. It was a consequence of proximity to something that didn't want witnesses to the specific transaction. She thought about Nkosi. The result she'd been hoping was wrong. She thought about Sokolova and Berlin and what Berlin had required. She thought about Owen Teller, about Abara's coffee cup, about the things she'd left in places where someone else would find them eventually and understand what they meant, about whether understanding what they meant changed what they were. She held all of it, her hands flat on the table. The thing that forced the reset, she said. It's still there. In the original galaxy, yes. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true and that being true doesn't require anything additional. The Echo's communication about this is the most incomplete part of the back channel because the Echo's own knowledge of it is secondhand and old, passed down from species that don't exist anymore in forms that can speak. What they know is that it exists and that it doesn't move. It doesn't need to move. It has a range of awareness that operates on a scale our physics doesn't have good language for. The Echo's word for it in the back channel translations is always slightly different, not because the translation is imprecise, because the Echo don't have one word for it either. They describe it in terms of what it does rather than what it is, and what it does is notice. It notices when the secondary signature reaches a specific intensity, and it responds to what it notices. What it does when it responds, Renn said. The back channel doesn't have that. The Echo's account stops at the point of response. What happened to the prior peak when it responded is not something the Echo have described in terms the ICD can work with. The assessment is that the description would require a frame of reference we don't have, and that the Echo have decided, over 11 years of back channel, not to attempt it yet. What they know is that the last time humanity crossed the threshold, this thing noticed, and what followed is why the prior peak made the choice it made, and that the threshold is not defined by what we've built or how far we've expanded. It's defined by the secondary signature, by the quality in the broadcast that the second program has been watching shift for 18 months. The same quality the Stratum are watching. Yes, the same quality the Echo recognized 3,000 years ago. Yes, he was still. In 3,000 years, the Echo have seen us approach this threshold twice before and watched something stop us both times before we crossed it. The ICD's assessment is that those interruptions were not random, that they were caused by the same source, and that the source responds to the secondary signature at a specific intensity, and that what we do between now and when we cross that intensity is what determines whether the response comes again. Renn looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the room around her, the 1948 panels, the warm light, the dark screen, the table's surface. She thought about what the ICD had built from the technology that had been left for it, about the rate of that building, about the 18 months of the secondary signature shifting in response. The Echo communication, she said. 11 years of back channel. What have they asked us for? Nothing yet. The back channel has been one-directional. Information from them to us. Context and history and the framework for understanding what we're approaching. 11 years of giving without asking. He paused. The 11 seconds on the flight are the first time they've communicated directly with an individual rather than through the back channel to the program. The ICD's assessment is that the back channel phase is ending, that the 11 seconds were an announcement, that what follows it is something different in kind, and that what's different about it is that it will require something from us rather than giving something to us. The individual on the flight, Renn said, she's been told to continue normal operations. Yes. For 3 weeks. Yes, while we completed the preparations for this room to have this conversation. And what comes after this conversation? He looked at her steadily. That's what this room calls Phase 2. The back channel's last direct communication arrived 3 days after the flight event. 11 words in translation. The ICD's linguists have been working on those 11 words for 3 weeks, and they have 4 possible readings, and they agree on one of them. She waited. The reading they agree on. The approach requires someone who understands what the approach has cost. She was quiet for a long moment. The corridor outside the room was silent. The room itself was silent except for the warm, steady light above her and the complete absence of anything else. She said, "I have a question." He waited. "Neil Brennan," she said. "Detroit, 5 years ago." She looked at him and her hands were flat on the table and her voice was level and contained no inflection that wasn't a question. When the ICD sent me to close him, did they know? He didn't move. Not the specifics, he said. They didn't know the nature of the contact event or when it would happen or who would be contacted. But the convergence was already building by that point. The second program had been running for 15 years and the precursor patterns were beginning to show. The signal calculation from 1977 was being revisited, and the three programs were starting at the analytical level to produce findings that were going to require reconciliation at a level above their compartments. He held her eyes. The program had to be clean when whatever was coming arrived. Anything that had talked, anything that had gotten outside the compartment, anything that created a thread in the institutional record that someone outside the structure could pull at the wrong moment. Brennan had talked to one person who he trusted and shouldn't have, and Dana Collier. Yes, routine maintenance, she said, of a secret that was always going to break open anyway. He looked at her without flinching, without softening the answer or offering anything that would make it easier to hold. Yes, he said. She reached into her inside jacket pocket and took out the photograph. She set it on the table between them. The woman on the left with a smile that started at her mouth and went all the way to her eyes, the kind of smile people have when they mean it and aren't thinking about whether they mean it. The teenager in the middle with her face screwed sideways at the camera, the precise expression of someone who has been asked to cooperate and is cooperating at exactly the minimum level required, and not one increment more. Brennan on the right, standing slightly apart from the woman, a small gap between his shoulder and hers, hands at his sides, all three in coordinated burgundy sweaters, the coordination obvious and slightly off in the way of outfits assembled by whoever cares most about the photograph being taken. Brennan wasn't unhappy in the picture. He was present. He was just standing the way some people stand when they are in a frame, at the edge of it, slightly waiting for it to be over so everyone could go back to being themselves. She looked at it. The man across the table didn't speak. He didn't look at the photograph. He looked at her face. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Long enough that the room's specific qualities, the warm, steady light, the complete and specific silence of a space 11 minutes below the surface of the Nevada desert, the air that tasted like nothing, became the background to the photograph rather than the other way around. She looked at the woman's smile. She looked at the teenager's expression and at the small gap between Brennan's shoulder and the shoulder of the woman standing next to him, the 4 inches of space that the coordinated burgundy made more visible than it would otherwise have been, that the photograph had been preserving unchanged for 5 years in her inside jacket pocket while she'd been doing the ICD's work. Then she picked it up. She put it back in her inside jacket pocket. She sat with her hands on the table for a moment after, flat. Still, the room was the room. She stood. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, the small, precise movement of someone who has done this before and knows what comes next. She walked out of the room. Back down the corridor, the original 1948 composite panels on both sides of her, showing their age in the consistent, specific way of things that have been in one place for a very long time. The corridor was exactly the length it had been when she walked it in the other direction. Closed doors on both sides, unchanged. The lights ran the same cool white they'd been running since 1948 or whenever someone had last changed the fixtures, and the air tasted like nothing all the way to the elevator. She pressed the single button and the doors opened and she stepped in and the doors closed. 11 minutes. She didn't count. At the top, she walked through the steel door and through the administrative building and out the front door and across the lot to her car. She got in. The car smelled like the desert and like the interior of a car that had been parked in the Nevada morning, which meant it smelled like something, which was different from where she'd been. She sat with both hands on the wheel for a moment. Then she started the engine and pulled out of the lot and drove to the gate and was waved through without stopping. And then she was on the road running away from the Nelly's range. The desert on both sides. The mountains to the west still the same brown and gray they'd been when she arrived. The installation quiet behind her and level 0 11 minutes below the ground she was driving on. She drove.